Here is a number that explains the entire air war over Europe. 11. That was the average number of flight hours a new Luftwaffe pilot of JG-300, one of Germany's primary home defense fighter wings, could expect to survive in the final 6 months of the war, from the autumn of 1944 through the spring of 1945. 11 hours of flying, approximately 4 combat sorties, including check flights, ferry flights, and the hours logged before the first engagement with an Allied fighter. 11 hours, then dead. This was not bad luck. This was not the product of inferior aircraft. The Bf-109G and Fw-190 that German pilots were flying in 1944 were competitive with anything the Allies had, and in certain flight regimes they were superior. The Bf-109G's climb rate at high altitude exceeded the P-51's in specific conditions. The Fw-190's roll rate was better than almost anything flying over Europe. These were not bad aircraft. They were demanding aircraft, machines that required real skill to extract their performance from. But they were not the reason new pilots were dying in 4 sorties. This was not the product of inferior courage either. The men who climbed into those aircraft in the spring and summer of 1944, knowing what the casualty statistics looked like because the casualty statistics were visible in the empty bunks and the names being crossed off the squadron board every few days, flew anyway. The word cowardice does not appear in any honest account of Luftwaffe pilots in the defense of the Reich. They were flying into formations of hundreds of bombers escorted by hundreds of P-51s, against odds that no professional calculation could describe as favorable, and they were doing it because the alternative was not flying, and the alternative was not acceptable to them. This was the product of a decision. A specific, identifiable, documentable, institutional decision that the Luftwaffe had been making since the first days of the war, and that, by 1944, had produced a pilot force of such catastrophic inexperience that 11 hours was not a statistical outlier. It was the mean. The decision was this: the best pilots would keep flying, not rotate back to training commands, not transition to instructor roles, not use the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of combat missions to build the next generation of pilots into something capable of sustaining the air war. Fly, kill, score. Keep flying. Keep killing, keep scoring, keep accumulating a personal record that the propaganda apparatus could point to as evidence that German pilots were the finest in the world, while the institution those pilots served was consuming itself in a feedback loop that the individual brilliance of those pilots could not arrest. Erich Hartmann flew 1,404 combat missions. He was credited with 352 aerial victories, more than any other pilot in the history of aviation. He flew his last combat mission on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, and shot down his 352nd aircraft hours before the war ended. He was 23 years old. He had been flying combat missions since November 1942. 3 years of continuous combat at the highest operational tempo any Air Force in history had sustained, against the best pilots the Soviet Union and the United States could produce, in a fighter that became progressively less competitive as the war went on, and Allied technology closed the gap that German engineering had opened in 1939. He survived. He was exceptional in this. He was exceptional in every measurable dimension of what fighter pilots are measured by. His ability to manage his aircraft, to assess the tactical situation with the speed that separated the living from the dead, to identify the precise moment of vulnerability in an enemy pilot's behavior and exploit it before that moment passed. These were the skills that had accumulated over 3 years of combat into something that no training program in any country could have produced in any amount of time less than 3 years of combat. And when the war ended, those skills ended with it. Not in the sense that Hartmann himself was dead. He survived, spent 10 years in Soviet captivity on fabricated war crimes charges, and eventually helped build the West German Air Force in the 1950s. But the specific, precise, hard-won tactical knowledge that he had accumulated in those 1,404 missions, the knowledge of how a Soviet Yak-9 pilot behaved under certain conditions at certain altitudes, how an American P-51 pilot reacted to a specific angle of attack, what a green pilot looked like from behind, and why that specific appearance mattered because green pilots made specific predictable mistakes that experienced pilots could exploit. That knowledge had never been systematically extracted, codified, and transmitted to the pilots who were replacing the men dying around Hartmann at the rate of 4 sorties per average pilot. It lived in Hartmann's hands and his instincts and his specific 3-year education. Nowhere else. When the war ended, it went with him into Soviet captivity, where it was useless. Across the English Channel, the United States Army Air Forces had been solving this problem since 1942, with a system so straightforward that its simplicity obscured how radical it actually was. When an American pilot survived enough combat to know what survival required, the Army took him out of combat and made him teach. This is the story of what happens when one Air Force treats combat experience as a national asset to be preserved and distributed, and another treats it as a personal attribute to be expended until the pilot who carries it is dead. Part 2. How the Luftwaffe built the best pilots in the world, and why that was a problem. In 1939, a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot arrived at his unit with more than 200 hours of flight time. This was not incidental. It was the product of a training philosophy that Hermann Göring and his senior commanders had developed specifically to address the lessons of the First World War, in which Germany had produced exceptional individual pilots, von Richthofen, Udet, Göring himself, but had failed to develop a training system capable of replacing them when they were lost. The interwar Luftwaffe had studied this failure and had built its training program around the premise that quality was more valuable than quantity, and that quality required time. The training system that produced these pilots was organized in sequential stages. The A schools provided elementary flying skills over a course that originally ran 7 months and included 72 hours of flying instruction. Students who passed moved to secondary schools for instrument flying and more advanced handling. Those who survived that moved to Ergänzungsjagdgruppen, operational training units, where they flew the specific aircraft type they would operate in combat and received tactical instruction before assignment to frontline units. The entire pipeline, from civilian to combat pilot, required the better part of a year and produced men who could genuinely fly before they were asked to fight. 200 hours was a lot of time in 1939. The average British pilot entering the Battle of Britain in 1940 had approximately 100 hours. Many had less. The rapid expansion of the Royal Air Force in the late 1930s, driven by the recognition that war was coming and that the existing pilot force was insufficient for the conflict it would have to fight, had compressed training timelines in ways that senior RAF officers understood were producing pilots who were competent in the air but inexperienced in combat. The Spitfire and Hurricane pilots who fought the Luftwaffe over England in the summer of 1940 were flying aircraft that were the equal of their opponents in most performance parameters, but they were fighting men who had 200 hours of carefully structured training against men who had 100 hours of compressed preparation. The result was visible in the kill ratios of 1940 and 1941. German pilots scored at rates that seemed implausible to anyone who examined them without understanding the training gap they reflected. Werner Mulders reached 100 aerial victories in July 1941, a milestone that no Allied pilot would approach for the duration of the war. Adolf Galland followed. By the end of 1941, multiple German pilots had exceeded scores that the entire RAF's highest-scoring pilots would never reach collectively. The scores accumulated not because German pilots were flying better aircraft. In most respects, the performance envelopes of the Bf-109 and the Spitfire were comparable, and not because they were fighting weaker opponents. They accumulated because the men in German cockpits had been flying longer, had seen more, had processed more of the specific education that combat provides and that no classroom can replicate. The Luftwaffe's leadership understood this and drew a conclusion from it that was, in the short term, correct, and in the long term, catastrophic. The conclusion was that the best pilots were too valuable to lose, that their extraordinary effectiveness, the specific ability of a pilot with 200 combat missions to consistently defeat pilots with 20, was a strategic asset that had to be preserved by keeping those pilots in the fight. That rotating experienced pilots out of combat and replacing them with less experienced pilots would cause the kill ratios to decline and the loss rates to increase, and that the morale and propaganda value of the mounting scores was itself a military asset that could not be sacrificed. The logic was internally consistent. In 1940 and 1941, when the Luftwaffe was conducting the kind of war it had been designed for, fast, decisive, operationally focused campaigns against opponents who could be overwhelmed before they had time to adapt, the logic produced exactly the results it predicted. The aces kept flying, the scores kept rising, and the kill ratios confirmed the premise that individual exceptional pilots were decisive. What the logic could not account for was duration. Germany had not planned for a long war. The entire strategic concept on which the Wehrmacht had been built assumed that conflicts would be decided quickly, that the combination of tactical excellence and operational surprise would produce results before the opponent's industrial and demographic advantages could be brought to bear. The campaigns of 1939 and 1940 had confirmed this assumption. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in 6 weeks. The assumption seemed so thoroughly validated that questioning it required a kind of institutional courage that the Luftwaffe's leadership did not possess. When the assumption failed, when the Soviet Union absorbed the summer of 1941 and kept fighting, when the United States entered the war and began converting its enormous industrial capacity into aircraft and pilots at rates that German planners had been told were impossible, the Luftwaffe was left with a training system designed for a short war and a pilot rotation policy designed for a war where individual excellence could be decisive. Both were wrong for the war they were actually fighting. The specific mechanism of the failure was not the aces themselves. Hartmann and Barkhorn and Rahl did not choose to keep flying. They were kept flying by a system that valued their individual scores more than the collective capability those scores represented. When Hartmann reached 300 victories, Göring had him temporarily grounded. Hartmann lobbied to be returned to combat, and Göring relented. The exchange captures the institutional pathology perfectly. The man responsible for the Luftwaffe understood that losing its top ace would be a morale and propaganda catastrophe, but he did not understand, or could not act on the understanding, that keeping the top ace in combat rather than in a training command was a different kind of catastrophe, operating on a longer timeline and at a larger scale. The morale catastrophe of losing Hartmann was visible and immediate. The institutional catastrophe of not using Hartmann's knowledge to build better pilots was invisible until it was irreversible. Part 3. The American System. Combat Knowledge as Institutional Property. On September 4, 1942, Major John Mitchell landed his P-38 at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with 7 aerial victories. He had been fighting in the Pacific since December 7, 1941. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced fighter pilots the United States Army Air Forces had produced. A man who had learned, through 9 months of combat in a theater where the equipment was inadequate and the odds were frequently unfavorable, what it actually took to survive and prevail against Japanese pilots who were, in the early months of the Pacific War, technically and tactically superior in most engagements. The Air Forces rotated him back to the United States. Not immediately. His tour continued through the famous mission to intercept and shoot down Admiral Yamamoto's transport aircraft in April 1943, a mission that Mitchell planned and led with a precision that required coordinating 16 P-38s over open ocean to arrive at a specific point at a specific moment based on decoded intelligence that could not be verified until contact was made. After that mission, Mitchell was finally rotated home. He became an instructor. The knowledge he carried, the specific, practical, hard-won understanding of how Japanese pilots behaved under different conditions, what maneuvers they favored, where their aircraft were vulnerable, how to set up an engagement that turned the P-38's different performance envelope into an advantage rather than a liability, went into classrooms and briefing rooms where new pilots absorbed it before they ever saw a Japanese aircraft. This was not an accidental outcome of the rotation system. It was the system's deliberate purpose, formalized in 1942 and expanded throughout the war. The Army Air Forces had established the rotation policy initially for reasons that were more about managing the psychological and physical attrition of combat flying than about deliberately preserving and distributing combat knowledge. A pilot who flew continuously without relief developed the specific degradation of performance that combat aviators called being burned out. The incremental loss of fine motor precision and rapid situational assessment caused by the cumulative stress of flying missions where the consequence of a slightly wrong decision was measured in lives. The rotation policy was designed to prevent this degradation by pulling pilots out of combat before it occurred. The knowledge transfer was a byproduct that the Air Forces recognized and institutionalized as the war developed. The system worked through a specific mechanism. A fighter pilot completed his combat tour. In the European theater, this was defined as a certain number of missions or flight hours, depending on the period and the command. When he completed his tour, he was assigned to a training unit in the United States. There, he taught. Not general aviation theory, not the principles of aerodynamics or the specifications of his aircraft systems. He taught what he had learned from doing it. The specific tactical knowledge that his tour had produced. This meant that a new pilot arriving at an operational training unit in 1943 was being taught by a man who had, 3 months earlier, been in combat against the aircraft and pilots the new pilot would shortly face. The gap between what the instructor knew and what the student needed to know was minimal, because the instructor had done recently, and in detail, exactly what the student was about to do. The curriculum that resulted from this system was continuously updated in ways that no academic aviation training program could have been. In early 1942, the instructors returning from combat had learned that the P-40 could not match the Zero in a turning fight, and that survival required using American aircraft advantages, the dive, the zoom climb, the willingness to disengage and re-engage on favorable terms, rather than attempting to outmaneuver a more agile opponent. By 1943, returning P-38 pilots were teaching the specific energy management techniques that made the Lightning effective at high altitude, despite its handling quirks. By 1944, P-51 pilots who had been hunting Luftwaffe fighters over Germany were teaching the specific approach angles and the specific engagement geometries that produced kills against Bf-109s and Fw-190s without putting the attacker in a position where the German aircraft strengths could be applied. The training hours reflected this systematically improving quality. In 1942, the average American fighter pilot arrived at his operational unit with approximately 300 hours of flight time. By 1944, the figure had increased to more than 400 hours. Not because the war had gotten easier and there was more time to train, but because the training system had gotten more efficient at using the time available. The returning veterans who were teaching better, more specifically, more relevantly, because each cohort of returning veterans arrived with more precisely targeted knowledge about the specific opponents and specific tactical challenges the new pilots would face. The contrast with the Luftwaffe system was not subtle. In the Luftwaffe, the experienced pilot stayed in combat. New pilots were assigned as wingmen to those experienced pilots, with the implicit understanding that they would learn by flying alongside them, that proximity and observation would transfer the knowledge that the ace had accumulated. This was the traditional aviation method of apprenticeship, and it had worked reasonably well in the early years of the war when experienced pilots outnumbered new arrivals, and each new pilot had a meaningful period of guided combat before he was expected to perform independently. By 1943, the ratio had inverted. The experienced pilots were dying or being overwhelmed by the scale of the combat they were facing. The wingman protection that the system assumed was producing the specific outcome it was designed to prevent. New pilots dying before they had learned what they needed to know, because the experienced pilot they were supposed to learn from was too occupied with his own survival to teach anyone anything. The American solution to this was not complicated. It was simply the decision that when a man had learned something that other men needed to know, getting that knowledge out of his head and into classrooms was worth more than keeping him in the fight. Germany never made that decision. Part 4. The Vicious Circle. In the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe entered what its own post-war historians described as a period of catastrophic attrition. The term is accurate and insufficient simultaneously. During the first 5 months of 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units in the European theater underwent what one analysis described as a complete turnover of pilots. This was not a figure of speech. The pilots flying on January 1, 1944, were, by the end of May, dead, captured, wounded, or hospitalized at rates that had effectively replaced the entire population of those units with new arrivals. The production achievements that German industry managed in 1944, genuine substantial increases in aircraft output despite Allied bombing, were entirely hollow because the aircraft were being flown by pilots who had arrived at their units with barely enough training to get the aircraft airborne and keep it there. The mechanism was a vicious circle in the specific technical sense of a feedback loop in which each iteration produces conditions that make the next iteration worse. Allied bombing of German synthetic oil production, which the 8th Air Force had begun targeting systematically in May 1944, reduced the fuel available for pilot training. The oil campaign was not immediately devastating. Germany had substantial reserves, and the synthetic plants, though damaged, could be partially repaired. But the sustained pressure of repeated attacks on the same facilities, combined with the disruption of the transportation network that moved fuel from production to consumption, produced a cumulative reduction in available aviation fuel that hit the training system before it hit frontline operations. When fuel was allocated under shortage conditions, frontline combat units received priority. Training units received what remained. When training fuel was reduced, training hours were cut. The Luftwaffe's training command began shortening courses not because it wanted to, but because the fuel to fly them at full length was not available. The A schools that had originally run 7 months were compressed. The B schools providing advanced training were shortened. The operational training units, the Ergänzungsjagdgruppen, where pilots should have spent weeks flying the specific aircraft they would operate in combat, were cut to 2 weeks and 20 hours. When training hours were cut, pilots arrived at their units less prepared. When pilots arrived less prepared, they died faster. When pilots died faster, the pressure on training programs to produce replacements more quickly increased. When training programs were compressed further to produce more replacements more quickly, pilots arrived with even less preparation. The loop accelerated with each iteration. The numbers document the spiral in specific and damning detail. In 1939, new Luftwaffe fighter pilots entered combat with more than 200 hours of flight training. In 1942, the average had fallen to approximately 210 hours, a modest reduction reflecting the early pressure of war's expansion on the training pipeline. In 1943, the average was 160 hours. By early 1944, it was 112 hours. By mid-1944, after the oil campaign had begun restricting training fuel, the average had fallen to approximately 60 to 80 hours. In the final months, some pilots were arriving at frontline units with as few as 30 hours of total flight time, less than peacetime requirements for a private pilot's license. The consequence of sending a pilot with 30 hours into combat against an opponent with 400 was not primarily a moral or tactical failure, it was a mathematical one. The gap in preparation was simply too large to be bridged by any combination of aircraft performance, individual courage, or tactical doctrine. A pilot with 30 hours did not have the reflexes that sustained flight experience builds. He did not have the instrument scan, the continuous automatic monitoring of his aircraft systems that experienced pilots perform without conscious attention, freeing their awareness for the tactical situation. He did not have the physical conditioning in his inner ear and vestibular system that allows experienced pilots to maintain spatial orientation through aggressive maneuvering. He was flying an aircraft he did not fully understand, in conditions he had never encountered, against opponents who had been doing this for years. He was dead in 4 sorties. The training accident rate alone, without any contact with the enemy, illustrated how far below the minimum survivable standard the late-war German pilot had been pushed. By 1944, training accidents were killing approximately 1/3 of each intake before the pilots qualified for combat. Men were dying learning to fly the aircraft they would never get to fight in. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were genuinely demanding aircraft, powerful, sensitive, unforgiving of the kinds of errors that a pilot with 30 hours would make. And the fuel shortage that had reduced training to 30 hours also reduced the supervised instruction time that might have compensated for the reduced total hours. Across the channel, the American training trajectory was moving in exactly the opposite direction. In 1942, the average American fighter pilot arrived at his operational unit with approximately 300 hours. In 1944, the figure had increased to more than 400 hours, with a substantial portion flown on the specific aircraft type he would operate in combat, and with tactical instruction provided by instructors whose combat experience was less than 6 months old. The American pilot of 1944 knew, from his training, specific things about specific opponents, things that had been discovered the hard way by pilots who had come back from their tours and been assigned to teach, precisely because the air forces understood that their knowledge was too valuable to be lost. The gap between American and German pilot preparation in 1944 was not 140 hours. It was the difference between a man who had been taught by someone who had recently survived the experience he was about to have, and a man who had been sent into that experience with 3 weeks of preparation and told that the experienced pilots around him would show him the rest. Except the experienced pilots were dying too, and there were fewer of them every month, and the 4 sortie new arrivals were not learning fast enough to become the experienced pilots who would teach the next 4 sortie arrivals. Galland, who watched this from his position as general of the fighter arm throughout 1943 and into 1944, understood what was happening and documented it in terms that his superiors found increasingly uncomfortable. His memos from this period described the pilot quality situation with a precision that was unusual for military staff documents. Specific numbers, specific units, specific loss rates that could not be explained by Allied performance or Allied numerical superiority alone. He argued that the fundamental problem was institutional, that the decision to keep experienced pilots in combat rather than in training commands had created a situation in which the knowledge required to survive was not being transferred to the pilots who needed it. Göring's response to these arguments was to accuse German fighter pilots of cowardice and to demand more aggressive tactics from men who were already dying at rates that no aggressiveness could meaningfully address. The accusation was not only wrong, it was a symptom of the same institutional failure that had produced the crisis. The failure to understand that individual courage, however genuine, cannot substitute for the systematic preparation that determines whether courage survives first contact with a more prepared opponent. Part 5. Hartmann and Barkhorn. In 1944, by the summer of 1944, Erich Hartmann was flying in a world that had become unrecognizable from the one in which he had begun his combat career. He had flown his first combat mission in November 1942 as a 20-year-old wingman assigned to the experienced Oberfeldwebel Alfred Grzyzlowski. Grzyzlowski had given him the specific practical instruction that the system was supposed to provide: how to identify the moment of attack, how to close to the range at which a single burst was decisive rather than a ranging spray that warned the target, how to break away before the target's wingman could respond. Hartmann had absorbed this and built on it over hundreds of missions, developing the tactical approach that would become his signature: close to point-blank range, a single burst at the moment of maximum target vulnerability, immediate disengagement before any response was possible. The approach worked because it was based on the specific physics of aerial gunnery. At long range, small aiming errors produced large misses. At close range, Hartmann typically fired from distances of 50 to 100 meters. The same aiming error produced a hit. The rounds that struck at that range did not need to be precisely placed. At 50 meters, the pattern of fire from a Bf-109's weapons covered enough of the target aircraft to guarantee critical damage from almost any angle. The approach also minimized the time during which Hartmann was in a position where the target's wingman could engage him, because the engagement was over before the wingman could react. It was elegant, lethal, and the product of 3 years of continuous learning that had begun with Grzyzlowski's instruction and continued through hundreds of engagements against Soviet and later American opponents. In the summer of 1944, the wingman assigned to fly on Hartmann's wing had 60 hours. Not 60 hours of combat experience, 60 hours of total flight time. These were not pilots who had been trained to the standard that would allow them to maintain formation through the G-forces of a hard turn, to keep Hartmann in sight during the rapid maneuvering that combat required, to protect his 6 o'clock when he was closing on a target. They were men who had been given the minimum preparation that the fuel shortage permitted and sent to JG-52 because JG-52 needed bodies to fill the establishment tables and because there were no other bodies available. Hartmann later described flying in 1944 in terms that were remarkable for their specificity. He was not, he said, leading a unit of pilots. He was leading a small group of experienced survivors surrounded by men who would be dead in 4 sorties and who could not contribute to the unit's combat effectiveness while they lived because the gap between their preparation and the demands of the tactical environment was simply too large to be closed in the time available. The specific knowledge that the experienced men carried, the tactical intelligence accumulated through hundreds of engagements, the understanding of how specific opponent aircraft types behaved under specific conditions, the ability to read a tactical situation and anticipate its development, was not being transferred to the replacements. There was no time. A man with 4 sorties to live does not absorb the lessons that 400 missions can teach, because the absorption requires time and the time is not available. Gerhard Barkhorn's experience in the same period was different in its specific character and identical in its institutional meaning. Barkhorn had been shot down 9 times during his career. Each shoot-down had added to the specific, hard-won knowledge of what it felt like to be on the wrong side of an engagement, the knowledge of what preceded a successful attack, what the attacker did that the defender could have countered if he had recognized it earlier, what the specific sensory signals were that a pilot was about to be hit. This knowledge, accumulated through 9 survivals of an experience that killed most pilots the first time it occurred, was among the most valuable tactical intelligence that any pilot in any Air Force possessed. By the end of 1944, Barkhorn was developing what the medical reports described as anxiety and increasing combat stress, that became especially apparent during missions in defense of the Reich. He was hospitalized. The second most successful fighter pilot in the history of aviation, the man with 301 victories and 9 survived shootdowns, was hospitalized for psychological breakdown caused by the cumulative weight of watching the unit he had spent years helping build be destroyed by the attrition of the replacement crisis that his continued presence in combat had done nothing to prevent. The irony was precise. Barkhorn's continued presence in combat had produced 301 victories. It had also meant that Barkhorn's knowledge, the specific understanding of aerial combat that those 301 victories represented, had never been systematically extracted and transmitted to the men who were dying around him. The 301 victories were real. The cost of achieving them rather than transferring the knowledge that would have enabled others to achieve even a fraction of them was also real, and was visible in the empty bunks and the 4-sortie life expectancy of the men who had been sent to replace the dead. Gunther Rall, the third highest scoring ace of the war with 275 victories, was eventually transferred to a command position in 1944 that partially removed him from frontline combat. His experience as a mentor and tactical advisor, the role that the American system would have assigned him years earlier, came too late to influence a training pipeline that had already been producing 60-hour pilots for months, but the transfer at least acknowledged, belatedly, what should have been acknowledged in 1942, that the value of an experienced pilot's knowledge exceeded the value of his continued individual contribution to the kill ratio. The 3 men who between them had accumulated nearly 1,000 aerial victories were, by the end of 1944, testifying in different ways to the same institutional failure. Hartmann, surrounded by men dying in 4 sorties, unable to do anything for them because the system had no mechanism for the knowledge transfer he could theoretically have provided. Barkhorn, hospitalized by the psychological cost of watching the consequences of that failure accumulate around him. Rall, finally in a partially institutional role, years after that role could have mattered. The knowledge was present in all 3 of them. The mechanism to extract it, systematize it, and distribute it had never been built. Part 6. The Verdict. The comparison that ends this story is not between Hartmann's 352 victories and the score of the highest scoring American ace in Europe. The highest scoring American ace in the European theater was Francis Gabreski, with 28 aerial victories. 28 against 352. By that individual metric, the Luftwaffe produced pilots who were 12 times more effective than their American counterparts. By that metric, Germany won the air war. It did not win the air war. The metric is wrong because it measures individual performance in an industrial conflict. It is the equivalent of measuring the quality of a manufacturing facility by the output of its single best worker, rather than by the average output multiplied by the number of workers. In a craft economy, the single best worker's output is the relevant number. In an industrial economy, in a war decided not by the ace in the leading aircraft, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of aircraft flown by thousands of pilots over thousands of sorties, the average worker's output multiplied by the number of workers is what matters. The air war over Europe in 1944 was emphatically an industrial conflict. American pilots in the spring of 1944 were arriving at their units with 400 hours of training, taught by instructors who had recently survived combat against the same opponents, carrying tactical knowledge that the rotation system had continuously updated as each cohort of veterans returned from their tours. These pilots were not individually the equal of Hartmann or Barkhorn or Rall. They did not need to be. They needed to be good enough to exploit the numerical and technological advantages that American industrial production had created, to keep their aircraft in the fight long enough for the weight of numbers to be decisive. And they were exactly that, because the American training system had specifically built them to be. The specific numbers that document the outcome are in the Luftwaffe's own records. In February 1944 alone, during Big Week, Luftwaffe dayfighter units in the European theater lost approximately 500 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. That was nearly 30% of the entire fighter pilot establishment in a single month. Over the first 5 months of 1944, total losses exceeded 2,000 pilots, effectively a complete turnover of the force. The production achievements of 1944, the increase in aircraft output that Speer's reorganized war economy genuinely achieved, produced aircraft that could not be flown effectively because the pilots trained to fly them were dying in 4 sorties. New aircraft sitting in depot, waiting for qualified pilots to ferry them to operational units. Operational units at nominal strength on paper and at a fraction of effective strength in practice, because a pilot with 60 hours counts as 1 pilot on the establishment table and as a fraction of a pilot in the tactical reality of combat against P-51 escorts. Gabreski had 28 victories. He also went home alive, spent several months teaching at a training unit, and survived the war. The 30 pilots he influenced at that training unit may have collectively produced scores that exceeded his own. The accounting that would capture this contribution does not exist, because the American military did not track it the way it tracked individual kills. The Luftwaffe tracked individual kills with meticulous precision. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves, with swords, with diamonds. The sequence of decorations that marked successive victory milestones created an institutional incentive structure that measured pilot value by the accumulation of personal scores rather than by institutional contribution. A pilot who reached 100 victories was a national hero, regardless of whether his continued presence in combat was worth more to Germany than his presence in a training command would have been. The decoration system, the propaganda apparatus, the institutional culture that celebrated the ace as the embodiment of German martial excellence, all of it pointed toward keeping the aces flying, killing, and scoring, rather than toward the harder and less visible work of building an air force that could sustain the attrition of a prolonged industrial war. The American system was less glamorous. Rotation was not a reward, it was a duty. The combat tour ended and the pilot went home and taught, and then he might go back for another tour, and the cycle continued. There were no decorations for teaching. There was no propaganda apparatus that celebrated the instructor as a national hero. There was only the specific, ongoing work of taking what men had learned in combat and putting it into the hands of men who were about to go. By July 1944, the average new Luftwaffe pilot was arriving at the front line with approximately 120 hours of flight time, just 15 to 20 of those hours flown on his operational aircraft type. The average new American fighter pilot was arriving with 400 hours, nearly half on his operational type, taught by someone who had been where he was going within the past 6 months. The 11-hour life expectancy was the arithmetic result of that gap applied to human beings. After the war, the surviving German aces were interviewed extensively by Allied intelligence officers and military historians who wanted to understand the Luftwaffe's trajectory from dominance to collapse. The aces were articulate and precise about what had happened. They described the progressive deterioration of the pilots around them, the replacements arriving with less and less preparation, the increasing frequency with which experienced pilots had to disengage from promising engagements to protect wingmen who were about to be shot down, the specific psychological burden of watching men die in 4 sorties, knowing that the knowledge to prevent some of those deaths existed and was not being transmitted. Hartmann, in post-war interviews, was asked directly whether the Luftwaffe's policy of keeping experienced pilots in combat rather than rotating them to training commands had been a mistake. His answer was careful and honest. He said that from the perspective of individual pilots, the policy made sense, that the experienced pilot's contribution to each mission was greater than any replacement's contribution could be, and that removing experienced pilots from combat would reduce the unit's effectiveness in the engagements being fought. He said that from the perspective of the air war as a whole, over the years it lasted and at the scale it reached, the policy had been wrong, because the individual marginal contribution of keeping him in combat was smaller than the institutional contribution of using his knowledge to build 50 pilots who could each survive and contribute individually. He said this after 10 years in Soviet captivity, in post-war interviews that have been preserved in the historical record. He understood what had happened. He had understood it while it was happening. The system had not. The sky over Germany in the spring of 1945 belonged to the Allies, not because Allied pilots were better in the individual sense than German pilots. Hartmann and the handful of surviving aces were, individually, still among the most dangerous pilots alive. The sky belonged to the Allies because the average Allied pilot had 400 hours and the average Luftwaffe pilot had 60. And because behind those numbers was a decision made years earlier about what combat experience was for. Germany decided it was for scoring kills. America decided it was for teaching. The 11 hours were the result.